What's up, fantasy football community? Today is the final of my 10 set of running backs. It's numbers 31 through 40. I hope you are as excited as I am to get the running backs out of the way and move on to the overview or review video next week of the running backs as a whole, numbers 1 through 40, and then move on to the electric receivers afterwards. So I got one question for you. Are you ready to talk fantasy football running backs numbers 31 through 40? Well, that's good enough for me. Number 31 is Damian Williams. Damian Williams' 2019 statistics in rushing and receiving will be left on the slide. The main things I want to highlight are his ESPN fantasy football total points last year was 145.1 in 2019. His fantasy football projected points this year has dropped by 30 points at 114.1 in 2020. His average fantasy football points per game last year was 13.19, and currently his ADP or average draft position is 78.44 with a high of 28, so he's going early third round or as low as pick 147, so that's quite a large margin. His ESPN positional ranking right now is 36, so he's the 36th highest ranking running back according to ESPN. He averaged 10.09 rush attempts per game, 45.27 average rushing yards per game. His average yards per rushing attempt were 4.5 yards. His average receptions were 2.72. His average receiving yards were almost 20 receiving yards a game, and average yards per reception was 7.1. The Chiefs' rushing offensive line ranking is 28, and their divisional opponents' rush defense rankings versus running backs are the Broncos at 10th, Raiders at 15th, and Chargers at 22nd in total points and points per game. Damian Williams summarized. To open the season, he is designated as the starter, but will be a member of a timeshare with the Chiefs' shiny new toy, Clyde Edwards-Helaire. The Chiefs' GM referred to Edwards-Helaire as special and unique and a franchise running back, which doesn't bode well for Williams' chances of holding on to the starting gig. In his first 6 seasons, Williams has only had one season of over 100 rushing attempts, and the most receptions he has had in a season was 30. He is a flex option at best, projected to get 10 carries and 5 receptions per game. Number 32 is Marlon Mack, which is quite the fall from last year where he was viewed as a potential top 10 running back. This year I have him ranked at 32. His ESPN fantasy football total points for last year was 185.3. His ESPN fantasy football projected points for this year is 132.6. So he projected to drop 53 points in 2020, which is pretty significant. His average fantasy points per week was 13.23, and his current average draft position is 96.89 with a high of 53 and a low of 153. Marlon Mack's ESPN positional ranking is currently 22nd, which isn't too bad. Average rush attempts was almost 18 rush attempts for almost 78 rushing yards per game and an average of 4.4 yards per carry. He averaged 1 reception per game for 5.85 receiving yards per game and an average yards per reception of 5.9. The Colts' offensive line rushing ranking is really good at 12th, and their divisional opponents' run defense ranking versus running backs is the Titans at 18th versus fantasy running backs in total points and points per game. The Texans are 26th and the Jaguars are 31st. Marlon Mack's summary. Marlon Mack has increased his workload and productivity each of the last 3 years. However, he will be competing for carries in his 4th year with second-round running back Jonathan Taylor. If the Colts had not drafted Taylor, I would have Mack much higher in my rankings, seeing as he had 247 rushing attempts and 1,000 rushing yards last year as the workhorse back. So had they not drafted Jonathan Taylor, I would see him as potentially a top 15 running back and would be drafting him in the first 4 rounds. But with Jonathan Taylor there, I see him in a timeshare, and so I can't obviously give him that nod. Going into the final season of Mack's rookie contract, I see the team shifting their focus to the younger, more talented back in Taylor and letting Mack go in free agency next year. So as a dynasty play, I would take Jonathan Taylor over Marlon Mack, and if he does leave the Colts, he'll probably go to a team with a lesser offensive line and maybe not an opportunity to be a starter, so his future's not looking the brightest right now.
Poor unfortunate souls in pain, in need.
He is currently a flex option for me, but if he is able to fight off Taylor for the bulk of the carries, or if Taylor is struck by injury, I could see Mack repeating his performance from last year, finishing as a lower end RB2. Number 33 is Phillip Lindsay, another guy that was a starter the last 2 years, but is going to be competing for snaps with a new free agent acquisition, Melvin Gordon, who just joined the team this year. His ESPN fantasy football total points for last year was 199.7, which is really good. Almost 200 points in fantasy last year is really solid. His fantasy football projected total this year is 156.6, which also isn't anything to sneeze at, but it's obviously 40 less points than last year, so he's not somebody I would really want to rely on as my RB1 or RB2. His average fantasy points per week last year was 12.48, and his current average draft position is 116.17 with a high of 72 and a low of 139. And the ADP for these players I get off cbssports.com, so if any of you are curious where I get these ADPs from, that is where. Phillip Lindsay's ESPN positional ranking right now is currently 19. His average rush attempts per game was 14, average rush yards per game 63, average yards per attempt was pretty good at 4.5, average receptions of 2.18, average receiving yards per game of 12.25, and average yards per reception at 5.6. The Broncos also have a good offensive line with their offensive rushing ranking of 11. Their divisional opponents' rushing defense versus running backs are the Raiders at 15th, Chargers at 22nd, and Chiefs at 27th in total points and points per week given up to fantasy running backs. Phillip Lindsay's summary. Coming off back-to-back 1,000 rushing yard performances, Lindsay looked poised for a third this year until the Broncos signed Melvin Gordon in free agency. Melvin Gordon is a bigger body running back that will get the carries near the goal line and on third down. Although the Broncos don't target their running backs in the receiving game very frequently, Melvin Gordon is also a much better receiver out of the backfield than Lindsay. Lindsay has played 31 of 32 possible games in his 2 NFL seasons, showing that he is durable and will be ready if Gordon goes down with an injury. Lindsay is currently a flex option at best, which is demoralizing for a player that has put up top 20 running back numbers the past 2 years. So it's very unfortunate for him that he has proven to be a top 20 running back the last 2 years, but the Broncos front office decided they wanted to go with Melvin Gordon instead of stick with Lindsay. So that's a little bit of underappreciation on their part. Ronald Jones II, or Rojo, his ESPN fantasy football total points last year was 167.3, and they project him to only score 9 points less at 158.9 in 2020. His average fantasy points per week last year was 10.45. His average draft position is currently 87.96 with a high of 48, a low of 119. His ESPN positional ranking is 25th. Average rush attempts per game was 10.75. Average rushing yards 45.25. Average yards per attempt was 4.2. Average receptions a game was almost 2. Average receiving yards a game almost 20, and average yards per reception 10, which is really good. Every time you throw to Ronald Jones, he gives you 10 yards. So that to me is very good. Buccaneers rushing offensive line is 23rd, which I feel like the drafting of Tristan Wirfs this year will hopefully dramatically improve that ranking. However, their divisional opponents are pretty tough, and the Saints have the 4th ranked defense in total points and points per week given up to fantasy running backs. The Falcons are 11th, and the Panthers, they just give up. They gave up. They're 32nd. Ronald Jones II summary. Bruce Arians has come out and said he plans to run more 12 personnel packages this year, which will put 2 tight ends on or near the line of scrimmage to help with run blocking, which both OJ Howard had his career with Alabama. He was a really good run blocker, and Rob Gronkowski he is also a big body tight end that can help in the run game as well. So I feel like 12 personnel won't really hurt them that much. It'll most likely help Ronald Jones, help the offensive line get more of a push and, open more lanes for Ronald Jones and, secure the perimeters of the line. So that's just good news for Ronald Jones. Buccaneers GM Jason Light said of Jones recently, "We do think Ronald hasn't even scratched the surface of what he can be, which is a good sign that the front office is behind him being the starting running back this year. 154 carries and 6 touchdowns walked out the door when Peyton Barber left in free agency this offseason, which will hopefully lead to a significant increase in carries and touchdowns for Jones II this year. The Broncos are currently rebuilding an offensive line that ranked 23rd in rushing offensive line ranking." That's what I said earlier. I'm just trying to hammer the point home. "They will have to see 2 borderline top 10 defenses versus running backs next year twice in the Saints and Falcons." So obviously when they go against those 2 teams twice a year, that's going to be tough matchups, but obviously it depends on how much the Buccaneers offensive line has strengthened and how the addition of Tom Brady and him being able to get the ball out of his hands quickly, the magic that is Tom Brady, how that can affect the running and passing game for the Bucs. So I feel like their offense will be much more efficient this year. So I expect Ronald Jones's numbers to go up in both the rushing and passing game. Jones II is a boom or bust candidate that I see as a flex initially, but could become a valuable RB2 as the year progresses. Number 35 is Carryon Johnson. ESPN Fantasy Football total points last year was 86 in 2019, and ESPN Fantasy Football projected total this year is 159.1, which to me I feel like is a little bit optimistic, but you never know. I'm no fortune teller. I can't tell you what's going to happen, so take my advice with a grain of salt. Average fantasy points per week was 10.75. Average draft position is 104.13 with a high of 26 and a low of 158. So obviously the fantasy football community doesn't know what to do with Carryon Johnson, because some people are drafting him at the early 3rd round, or they're drafting him as late as the 10th or 11th round. No, even later than that, like the 14th round. So he's getting drafted between the 3rd round and like the 15th round. So I don't know, throw a dart. Whichever round it lands on, that's where you try to look for him. Carryon Johnson's ESPN positional ranking currently is 54. So that just kind of makes me a little confused. If he's currently projected to be the 54th best running back, then why on God's green earth would you take him with the 28th pick? Doesn't make any damn sense. ESPN is telling you there's 53 running backs that are better than him, and you're taking him with the 28th overall pick? What? His average rush attempts last year was 14.12. Average rushing yards was 50.37. Average yards per attempt was 3.6. Average receptions was 1.25. Average receiving yards was 15.87. And average yards per reception was really good at 12.7. The Lions' offensive rushing line ranking is 20th. So not the best, not the worst. Kind of close to the middle of the pack. Divisional opponents' run defense rankings versus running backs. We got the Vikings at 14, Bears at 17th, and Packers at 23rd. Carryon Johnson's summary. Johnson, the Lions' 2nd round pick from 2 years ago, is now having to look over his shoulder as the Lions spent a 2nd round pick in this year's draft on running back DeAndre Swift. Carryon has missed 14 games in his first 2 seasons in the league, playing in only 18 of a possible 32 games. DeAndre Swift is viewed as a more complete back in both the running and passing game, and is going to be the Lions' lead running back sooner rather than later. Both young backs figured to play an important role in Matt Patricia's running back by committee approach, allowing neither back to get the volume of carries necessary to be a top 15 back. Flex at best until he plays a full season injury free. Are you guys still with me? Are you still there? You still awake? Well, I hope so. I hope I can get more than 5 views on this video, and I hope you guys start to appreciate appreciate the work I put into these videos. Coming in at number 36 is the guy that never sees the field, Darius Slay. His ESPN Fantasy Football total points last year was 58.4 in 2019. His ESPN Fantasy Football projected total this year is very optimistic at 147.2. Average fantasy points per week last year was 11.68. Average draft position is 80.92 with a high of 40 and a low of 130. Darius Slay's ESPN positional ranking currently is 68. He averages 8.4 rush attempts per game, 49 rushing yards a game, and average yards per attempt is 5.8. Average receptions 1.4 a game, 15.8 receiving yards per game, but his yards per reception is pretty good at 11.3. The Redskins rushing offensive line ranking is 18, and their divisional opponents run defense rankings versus running backs are the Eagles at 7 in total points and points per week given up to running backs. The Cowboys, this year's Super Bowl champs, are ranked 12th, and the Giants are ranked 19th. Darius Slay's summary. A former second-round pick out of LSU, Geis has finished both of his first 2 seasons in the NFL on the injured reserve list. A torn ACL robbed him of his rookie season, and 2 knee surgeries in the last 2 years has limited him playing in just 5 out of 32 possible games. That is not good. He was seen as a playmaker entering the NFL, but after 2 years of injuries, he is barely holding on to the title of starting running back. This year is competing for the starting role with veterans Adrian Peterson, J.D. McKissick, and Peyton Barber, and Bryce Love, while also trying to fend off newly drafted running back / receiver Antonio Gibson. He will be listed as a starter, but if history repeats itself, he could be headed for injury reserve again, with Antonio Gibson being eyed as the future at the position. So I wouldn't spend really any pick on him. I would take him obviously later rounds of the draft, the second to last or maybe even the last round, because in 2 years he's been injured for all but 5 games. So I wouldn't want to waste a quality pick on a player that can never get on the field. Tevin Coleman, he is currently my 37th best running back. ESPN Fantasy Football total points last year was 136.4. His projection for this year is 8 points less at 128.9. His average fantasy points per week last year was 9.74. Average draft position is 94.89 with a high of 56 and a low of 160. His ESPN positional ranking is 39. He averages 10 rushing attempts per game for close to 40 yards and 4 yards rushing per attempt. Averages 1.5 receptions per game, almost 13 yards receiving a game, and 8.6 yards per reception. The 49ers have a top 10 offensive line, ranking at 8th. Divisional opponents run defense rankings versus running backs. We got the Rams at 16, Seahawks at 20th, and Cardinals at 21st. So if Kyle Shanahan could pick one of his running backs to be the starter and the lead bell cow, they have defenses in their division that they can run against. However, Kyle Shanahan likes to run running backs by committee, so there should be more opportunities for both Tevin Coleman and Raheem Mostert this year, considering they just shipped away Matt Breida to the Dolphins. But unless one of the two gets injured, either Raheem Mostert or Tevin Coleman, I don't see either of them being a solid RB2 player. I feel like they'll be flexes, and 1 week Tevin Coleman will be a stud and win you your fantasy matchup of the week, and then the next week if Raheem Mostert tells Kyle Shanahan a joke he likes, then Raheem Mostert will be the starter and Tevin Coleman will be warming up the bench. So Raheem Mostert's electric end to the season and playoff run, I feel like he'll get the edge and be the primary workhorse back, and Tevin Coleman will be relegated to the sideline. That's my summary of Tevin Coleman. Number 38 is a man that I've always loved, Adrian Peterson. It's unfortunate he plays for such a horrible team now, but he's still the man. He scored 149 points according to ESPN Fantasy Football last year. ESPN Fantasy Football projects him to score a meager 63 points in 2020, which is very unfortunate for a man that still has some gas left in the tank. He scored an average fantasy points per week of 9.93, and his average draft position currently is 133.95 with a high of 109 and a low of 214. He is most definitely not a dynasty option. Adrian Peterson's ESPN positional ranking currently is 32nd. He averaged 14 rush attempts per game last year for almost 60 yards and 4.3 yards per attempt. His average receptions were 1.13, average receiving yards of almost 10 receiving yards a game, and average yards per reception is 8.4. The Redskins' rushing offensive line is 18th. Their divisional opponents are the Eagles at 7th, Cowboys at 12th, and the Giants at 19th. Adrian Peterson's summary: although he is no longer capable of rushing for 2,000 yards a season, at the age of 35, he is still able to provide over 200 carries a season the last 2 years for the Redskins. So even though he's 35 years old, he still has had 200 carries a season the last 2 years. So there's a lot of young guys in the NFL that can't handle 200 carries, and Darius Slay sure as heck can't, considering he gets about 10 carries in a season before he tears his ACL again. He rushed for 898 yards last year, which was 15th among rushing running backs, and scored more than 10 fantasy points 8 out of 15 games last year. So he had 898 rushing yards last year, but at an average of 60 rushing yards per game, he would have beat the 1,000-yard rushing mark had he played the first 5 games of the season instead of Darius Slay. With so much young competition at the position this year, it will be hard for Peterson to try to carve out a serviceable role out of the backfield. The team has 3 young running backs that they would like to develop in Darius Slay, Antonio Gibson, and Stanford star Bryce Love, along with veteran J.D. McKissick and Peyton Barber. At this point in Peterson's career, he is no longer as strong of a runner and was never a receiving threat, limiting his opportunities for points. He should be off your draft radar and should be viewed as a possible waiver wire target if Geis goes down again. So the last 2 years, Adrian Peterson has been a stud, even though everybody in the fantasy world thought he was done. He's old, he's lost a step. But Darius Geis the last 2 years continues to get injured, and because they haven't had a capable backup, Adrian Peterson has had to step in and lead the show, and he's done a good job. He's not elite like he used to be, but he's still a good running back. And so if the Redskins decide not to give Bryce Love a shot, or JD McKissick, or even Peyton Barber, if they go into the season with Antonio Gibson, Darius Slay, and Adrian Peterson, then Adrian Peterson could see some action if Darius Slay goes down. But because the Redskins have so many more options this season, they might just decide to cut Adrian Peterson altogether, saving them $2.5 million this year. So as much as I love Adrian Peterson and I would like to see him have one last solid year, I don't see it happening, but there's always the chance. And at 39, my favorite little receiver slash running back, Tarik Cohen. His ESPN fantasy football total points last year was 163.9. They have him improving by 11 points at 174.6 in 2020. His average fantasy points per week last year was 10.24, which is pretty solid. He's not an RB2, but to get 10 points a week from your flex is good. I like it. His ADP is 103.15 with a high of 65 and a low of 129. Tarik Cohen's ESPN positional ranking currently is 27th. He did most of his work through the air, so his rushing stats are gonna look very depressing. His average rush attempts per game was 4. He had 13.31 rushing yards per game. Average yards per attempt was 3.32. Now this is where he makes his money. Average receptions, almost 5 receptions a game, 30 receiving yards, and close to 6 yards per reception. The Bears' rushing offensive line ranking is 29th. You'd think with how much resources that they've spent on their defensive line and their defense in general, that they would see that, our defensive line's important. Maybe we should put some resources into our offensive line too. But they're like, no, that's alright. So I don't see him or David Montgomery getting the help that they need. Their divisional opponents' rush defense rankings versus running backs are the Vikings at 14th, Packers at 23rd, and the Lions are 29th. That's pretty sad. Tarik Cohen's summary. Since entering the league in 2017, Cohen is yet to post a season of 100 carries or more. He is only valuable in PPR leagues due to his inefficiency and lack of attempts in the running game, and is relegated to a third down and change of pace back. He is a lesser Austin Eckler in the fact that he will have more receptions than carries and will make most of his points off the points per reception if you're in a full points per reception league, as he is not a touchdown magnet either. He has a limited role in the running game, but is very much involved in the passing game, which helped him to a fantasy finish of 11th in 2018. I view him as a flex at best. At number 40, the new young buck for the Ravens, J.K. Dobbins. His ESPN fantasy football total points last year was 0 because he's a rookie. ESPN fantasy football projected total this year is 117.2, which I would like to see a little higher. I feel like he'll get more opportunities than they're giving him credit for. Average fantasy points per week last year was 0. His average draft position is 90.20 with a high of 33 and a low of 124. His ESPN positional rankings is a smiley face because he doesn't have a ranking right now because he's a rookie. These are averages from his season at Ohio State. So he averaged 23.15 rushing attempts per game, which is amazing. He averaged 154.07 yards rushing per game, which is also amazing. His average yards per attempt was also amazing. 6.65, average receptions of 1.76, averaged 19 receiving yards per game, and average yards per reception was 10.7. The Ravens rushing offensive line ranking is the 3rd best in the NFL, and their division opponents rushing rankings versus running backs are the Steelers at 6, Bengals at 24th, and Browns at 25th. J.K. Dobbins summary. He is the future at the running back position as Mark Ingram continues to get older. He is initially expected to be used as a change of pace and receiving back, but could be more involved in the offense if he outperforms Ingram. I could see Dobbins used in a committee similar to the one Ingram was used in with the Saints, where Dobbins is used equally in the run game, but taking most of the passing downs, while Ingram gets most of the red zone and short yardage work, similar to how Alvin Kamara and Mark Ingram worked together with the Saints. With the league's 3rd best rushing offensive line and the best rushing offense in the NFL last year, the Ravens are going to look to be a run-first team again, giving Dobbins ample opportunities to showcase his talent. I view Dobbins as a flex or a handcuff initially, with the potential to become an RB2 as the year goes along. So if you have Mark Ingram, then maybe it wouldn't be a bad idea to also draft J.K. Dobbins in the mid to late rounds. That way you know if Mark Ingram goes down, boom, you got J.K. Dobbins right there. Plug him in and start him. And in Dynasty, I feel like J.K. Dobbins would be a good pickup as well because he's obviously a rookie and he was a monster at Ohio State, and going to the #1 rushing offense in the NFL can never be a bad thing. So that's running backs 31 through 40. Hopefully you enjoyed every second of it. For all 3 of you that watched, thank you very much. And for all the millions out there that are missing out on this great content, well, sucks to be you.